Amen. Wonderful singing. Bill Counts is here this morning. Some of you know him. I was thinking maybe, Bill, we should have sold tickets. $1 million. All we need to sell is one. That's all. Okay. Be somebody, I'm sure. Anyway, Bill, for those that don't know Bill and I spent over 25 years together in ministry. He and his wife Beverly have retired down to Fredericksburg. Bill, when Wesley Ard and some other people kept saying, why don't you start a cowboy church? I said, because I can't find stirrups short enough to ride a horse for me, which is kind of true. And they said, well, why don't you call it a country church? And we did. And we talked to Bill and Bev, and they encouraged us, and they prayed for us, and they also supported us by coming up from Fredericksburg once, twice a month to help us get this started and teach for us. And so we were, our church will ever be indebted to you as well as all of us, to so many of us. He's a mentor, he's a dad. Come on, Bill. He's Mr. Grace.
Okay, some things never change. No matter how much we advance. Reminds me of my 40th high school reunion where I saw a lot of folks I hadn't seen for years. And it's the same thing here, and it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be here for this occasion, and really wonderful to be in this building. And the building, even though it was built quite a few years ago, it looks in good shape, and I really, really enjoy being here and enjoy seeing all of you. And I'm not sure where Beverly is in the crowd. She's someplace, okay, over there. All right. Okay, I turned 85 last December, and there are a lot of disadvantages to obviously getting old. I come up here with a cane because I have peripheral neuropathy in my feet, and you get other illnesses, and of course, eventually, and this will happen to us all, I'll get an illness I will not recover from, and I'll go to be with the Lord. So there's all that as a disadvantage, but there are a couple of advantages to age. And one of them is you have a perspective. When I had been a Christian about 10 years, I became a Christian in college when I was 18, I could look back and see that God had done certain things in my life over 10 years. But having been a Christian now much longer, for many decades, I can look back and see how God has worked more and more in different ways at different times, and just have much more experience with God. And that is one of the few advantages of aging. And so this morning I would like to talk some about that, and I would, not my aging, but some of the experiences over the years, and I want to base it on 2 Timothy 1:11 and 12. And Paul writes in 2 Timothy 1:11 and 12, "And of this gospel I was appointed a herald and an apostle and a teacher. And that is why I am suffering as I am. Yet this is no cause for shame, because I know whom I have believed, and am convinced that he's able to guard what I have entrusted to him until that day. And what I'm going to dwell on is the statement, I know whom I have believed and am convinced that he's able to guard what I have entrusted to him until that day. Now, if we look at this verse, there are several things about it. When Paul says, I know whom I have believed, there are several Greek words for know. And the one he uses here is the idea of certainty. And Paul has an absolute certainty about the one whom he knows. I know with a certainty, a settled assurance. And when he says, I am convinced, I know whom I have believed and am convinced, that's the word persuaded, and it's the idea that he's absolutely persuaded and sure. And when he says, I'm convinced that he's able to guard what I've committed or entrusted to him until that day. The word here for entrusted is the same word as for a deposit, like a bank deposit. And I've made a deposit with him, with God, Paul says, and I'm sure he's able to guard it, what I've entrusted to him until that day. And by the way, as I go through the message, I'm going to kind of quote it from the King James instead of this more modern translation. I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him until that day. Now, what's interesting is Paul says, I know whom I have believed. He doesn't say, I know what I have believed. He doesn't say, I believe a bunch of facts, though he did. But he says, I believe in a person. And his whole trust here is in a person about whom he is absolutely sure, and he has committed his life. His deposit was his life and his soul. He committed his life and his soul to this person, and he had no doubt that that was the right thing to do. One of the blights on church history was the Crusades. Between 1100 and 1300 AD, the armies of Europe invaded the Holy Land and took it over. And they did things like come to the city of Jerusalem, conquer it, slaughter men, women, and children by the thousands. And then after they'd slaughtered them, they had a Holy Communion service to celebrate. And the Muslim world has never forgotten that. Now, if you'd ask these crusaders, what do you believe? What facts do you believe? Do you believe in the deity of Jesus Christ? Of course. Do you believe in the Holy Trinity? Absolutely. Do you believe in the resurrection? Sure. Do you believe in the virgin birth? We know it for sure. We believe all the facts of Christianity. And yet, as far as believing in the person of Jesus and trusting Jesus personally and having Jesus work in their lives, they knew nothing. So Paul doesn't say, here are a list of the Christian facts I believe, but here is the person in whom I believe. And I have committed absolutely everything to him. Now, Paul wrote this in the early 60s of the first century. It was the last letter from his pen. He is near death and ready to literally have his head chopped off, which is how he died as the Romans executed him. And in 2 Timothy 4:6, he says, for I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. And drink offerings were where you threw wine or whatever, threw it out of a glass onto the offering. And he says, I'm being poured out in death, but I'm really dedicated to the Lord. And he says, the time of my departure is near. And he means by his departure, his death. And execution was awaiting him. But other things were not going well. Many one-time followers were deserting him. In 2 Timothy 1:15, he says, "You know that everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me, including Phygellus and Hermogenes." Probably, these were people from Ephesus who were there in Rome. And when Paul was put to death, it was different from Jesus. Jesus, was arrested at midnight and executed the next day. He was not a Roman citizen. Paul was a Roman citizen, and you had to go through all these procedures to execute someone like him. And there were various judicial procedures, and it took a period of months. And during this time, there were people that could stand up and support him. And all those in Asia were worried about their own skin. And if, we support Paul, maybe they'll come after us. So they deserted him. He says in 2 Timothy 4:9, "Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica." So here was a close associate who had worked with Paul and been around Paul, seen Paul do miracles. He loved this present world and deserted him. 2 Timothy 4:14 through 16, "Alexander the metalworker did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. And you too should be on your guard against him, because he strongly opposed our message. At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against him." So again, he was abandoned by a lot of former followers who didn't stand with him. And he had people opposing him like Alexander the metalworker. So it's not like, Billy Graham is going to turn 100 years old in November. And if he lives until then, there will be a great celebration of what he has done and the ministry he's had and the integrity he had. And he deserves it. So he'll be widely celebrated, and there'll be news stories and magazine stories and internet stories, etc. But Paul dies, and there are not a bunch of people celebrating. There are, not celebrating, but not a bunch of people, who are expressing their appreciation for him and what he's done. When he dies, he's deserted by a lot of former followers. He's facing a lot of things alone. It's one of the most difficult times of his life. And he says in the midst of that, "You know what? I know whom I have believed, and I'm absolutely persuaded that he is able to keep what I've committed unto him against that day." Now, the very first time I talked on that verse was back in the spring of 1959. I was a senior at Dallas Seminary down the road, and it was my senior sermon. All the seniors were put in a class where they got up and gave sermons to each other, okay? It was our senior sermon. And I preached on this verse, and one of the reasons I preached on this verse is I was trying to assure myself, because I wasn't facing death or anything like that, like Paul, but I was facing a very hard time in my life. I married my high school sweetheart in 1956. And I'm from Denver, and we had gone together. And we had a good relationship, and she went to school in the West Coast, and I went to school in the East Coast, and we wrote letters back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. And I became a Christian in college, and after a couple years, and we would be together during the summers, I realized, I can't continue this relationship because she's not a Christian. So I said to the Lord, when we were home for Christmas vacation and together, I said, "Lord, if she does not become a Christian while I'm here, I'm going to break off the relationship." So on Christmas Eve, she tells me that she has become a Christian. And she went to a girls' school in Oakland called Mills College. There was one witnessing Christian in the whole school. And that person happened to become a friend of hers and led her to the Lord. So we felt, the Lord is in this relationship, and we did everything right, et cetera, and we ended up getting married in 1956, and then ended up coming down to seminary, and she was a social worker and worked at the Family Service Agency, and I'm going through seminary. And I'll say more about this later, but I was legalistic in a lot of ways, and kind of had absorbed that from the group that brought me to Christ. I was immature. A lot of it was my fault. But anyhow, I was clueless about this, and one day we sat down to dinner, and she said, "I want to separate." And here I am in seminary. So we tried to work things out. They didn't work out, so she filed for divorce. Now, she didn't hate me or anything like that, and there was no abuse, but she just felt the marriage wasn't going to work, and I wanted to be a missionary, and she couldn't see being a missionary. So she filed for divorce, and I went to one of the professors at the seminary that I respected, and he was a very godly man, and God used him in the seminary, but he gave me, on this occasion, very bad advice. In those days, you did not have no-fault divorce. You actually had to charge the person you were divorcing with something wrong, like either adultery or they'd beat you up, or what most people chose was what was called mental cruelty. Well, you can define that a lot of different ways. Like, at the breakfast table, you don't say what you ought to say, and that's mental cruelty, whatever. But she just felt the marriage wouldn't work, and it was best to get out of it. We didn't have any children, etc. So she charged me with mental cruelty because she had to. She didn't want to, but she had to. And this professor said, "Well, do you think it's right for her to get a divorce?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Are there biblical causes?" And by that, he was thinking of something like adultery. And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, then she's doing what's wrong." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you have to oppose it." Well, opposing it means I had to get a lawyer and oppose her divorcing me. Now, you just think of this for a moment. Suppose I had won the case. Okay, I'd have a wife who is married to me because the law is forcing her to be married to me. So that's a great foundation to build a marriage on, right? Okay. So obviously, she ends up winning the case, and the divorce trial happens on our anniversary. So here I am, graduating from seminary, a month out. There are not a lot of churches that were seeking to have me on their staff. And I had an Ivy League education. I had 4 years beyond that, so there's 8 years of education, a lot of money spent, and it's like, what am I going to do? Paul said, "I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he's able to keep what I've committed unto him against that day." There were a few people in seminary. A lot of them didn't even know I was going through this. There were a few guys in seminary that I talked with that were friends, that I shared everything. And one of them had been on staff of Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now called Cru, which works with college students. And it's a huge organization today with thousands of staff members. I think I read someplace they have several hundred in China alone. It's worldwide, multi-million-dollar budget, etc. But back then, it was a very small organization. Maybe there were 20 or 30 staff members in the U.S. I had met Bill Bright when I was in college when he spoke there, and he kind of knew who I was. I wrote him a letter. My friend suggested I go on Campus Crusade staff. So I wrote him a letter and told him my situation, and he said, "That's all right, come on." And they had their conference ground outside of Minneapolis, and I went there never having attended a Campus Crusade meeting because it was not on our campus, never having been involved with it, never having been a part of it. That's how I went there, and I left the campus director for the work at UCLA. I would run into people 2 or 3 years later who had been in my class at seminary, and they were still looking for a church job someplace. Here I graduated in the worst situation, freshly divorced, and within a couple of months, God put me in the ministry. So I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he's able to keep what I've committed unto him against that day. I still was hoping the marriage would work out, even though it was realistically hopeless. But my first wife remarried, and it so happened, not just chance really, but it's the Lord working. The person who was assigned to work with me and do the work with the women on campus was Beverly. So we had been friends and co-workers, and we became romantically involved, and we got married in 1961, and we've been married for 56 years. Okay. Well, I continue to work with Campus Crusade, and we fast forward to the year 1968. And things had changed on the campus, and we had moved out to California to be at their headquarters, and I was to speak and travel. And whereas in the 1950s, everybody's clean cut and looks sharp, and the athlete is celebrated, in 1968, the campus is wholly different, in California at least. I mean, they're barefoot, beards, drugs, sex. The campus hero is a campus radical, not the athlete. And I felt that Crusade was not really keeping up with the changes, and I was frustrated over other things. They had growing pains. And so one day I just felt I'd had it. So I walked up to Bill Bright's office and resigned. I didn't know what I was going to do. I resigned. Now, it was an impulsive act. Ideally, I should have left Crusade because God was calling me to other things, but I should have planned it ahead of time, worked on it ahead of time, left graciously, etc., because they'd done a lot to help me, but I just left. So I come down that morning. We had just bought a new house, our first house. We had 2 small children. Beverly was pregnant with our 3rd daughter, and I announced to her, I just left Campus Crusade. I'm very sensitive to her needs. And I should have left, but it was, a mistake the way I did it. So here I am, out in California. What am I going to do? And, it was my fault. It was an impulsive act. But the Lord even takes care of us when we do wrong things. 2 others left at the same time I did. One of them was Hal Lindsey, and he was a friend of mine at the time. He wrote the late great Planet Earth in 1970. It sold 35 million copies, was translated into 52 languages, and was one of the best-selling books of the 1970s. And he had a friend in Los Angeles who was well-to-do, and fraternities and sororities, some of them were going bankrupt because of all the changes and everything. So he purchased a fraternity house by UCLA for some Christian students to live in. And when he found out we had left Crusade, he said, I'll take care of the facility, I'll refurbish it, make it a place where students can live, and you guys set up a spiritual program. So we ended up doing that. We called it the Light and Power House. The students called it, and this was very in vogue in the day, and Beverly's really offended by this, they called it the JC Light and Power Company. Okay. And if you were around in the 60s, you know that was really cool, okay. And students ended up coming from all over. We didn't give degrees. We had a curriculum that went through 3 years. We didn't give degrees. But at that time, they didn't care. You know, they were fed up with college, fed up with the establishment, so they just drop out and come. And we did that for a number of years. And during that time, I'll tell you a couple of stories. There was a student who'd been with us about a year. His name was Chris. And the fraternity was located up from Westwood Village, kind of up a hill. And Westwood Village was kind of the college place around UCLA where the shops and restaurants were, and there was a grocery store. So one night, he and a couple of other students went out, and of all things, they got drunk. And so they go to the grocery store and take a couple of these, grocery carts, go up the hill, get in the carts, and race down drunk. Okay. So, not the smartest thing in the world to do. So I find out about it, and the next day I call him in, and I say, Chris, okay, you shouldn't have done that, blah, blah, blah. Gave him a little lecture. But I said, I want you to really shape up. If you do it again or anything like that, you're out. But this time is for good. So I talked to him later on, and he said that was kind of a transforming moment in his life. He went on to get a PhD in church history and became a scholar of the early church, not the apostolic church, but the early church around 1 to 400 AD. Became the dean of a college, and now he's the chancellor of a university back east, and he also heads up a strong spiritual ministry. And there he was, just a kid at the Light and Powerhouse. There was another guy who came, who was a little older, who'd actually graduated from law school but hadn't really gotten into his law practice. And he wanted just to get some basic grounding for a year. So he came out to the Light and Powerhouse, and we had meetings in the evening for the community. And one evening, there was a lady who came to the meeting, and she knew he was a lawyer. So she went up to him and she said, I teach in one of these high schools in West Los Angeles, and it was a very heavy Jewish population, and this particular high school was about 80 or 90% Jewish. And she said, I wear a cross around my neck, a necklace. And the principal told me that because of all these Jewish students, I can't wear my cross. So he went with her to the principal and explained, her constitutional rights, etc., and she got to continue wearing her cross. However, from that event, he became concerned about the legal rights of Christians. And so he set up an institute called the Rutherford Institute. And there are many groups that do this today, but this was the very first group that began to defend the rights of Christians. A small sidelight. I think he was a Democrat, but he was all for the underdog. And he happened to run across the case of Paula Jones, who was suing Bill Clinton. So he became the co-counsel and assembled a legal team, and they sued Bill Clinton for sexual harassment or whatever. And Bill Clinton lied under oath, and it was because of that he, got impeached. And of course, the Senate didn't finalize the impeachment. But anyhow, we played a little minor part in history there. However, the important thing that he did was not that. And as a result of that, he got interviewed on 60 Minutes and things like that. But the important thing is he was the guy that was kind of the forerunner and set the example for many others to defend the legal rights of Christians. Well, things began to run their course in California. And so what happened is that we decided to move back to Texas. Beverly had her parents and 3 sisters who lived in Texas, and she, wanted to be close to her family. And we came here to work with Probe Ministries, which was headed up by a longtime friend, Jimmy Williams. Carol, his wife, is right down there. Carol, raise your hand. Okay, there she is. Their son, Todd, is a member of this church. I don't think he's here this morning, and he sings. And also their daughter, Leslie, I think, sang at your Christmas program. And we set up what was called the Center for Advanced Biblical Studies, and it was kind of a lay training school. But at the time, I started to become interested in churches. Now, I'd always attended churches as a believer. I had been an elder in 2 churches. But I always kind of felt, if you really want to see where things are happening, do it in a parachurch organization. Para means beside. And parachurch organizations are organizations like Campus Crusade or Young Life. And they focus on a kind of a narrower entity, like Young Life focuses on high school students and Campus Crusade on college students, etc. If I could put it this way, they're like if you go to the Apple store, you're focusing on computer stuff and iPhones and Apple stuff. If you go to Walmart, there's clothing, there's grocery store, there's kind of something of everything. Okay, the church is like a Walmart. There's something of everything. You've got to take care of children, you've got to take care of infants, you've got to take care of married couples, you've got to take care of singles, you've got to take care of older people, younger people. You can't just focus on one group, and so it's much more complex. And I had felt the churches were kind of behind the times very much, but this church had just been built, and it was founded by Dr. Gene Getz. And it was founded in 1978. When I say this church, I mean the church that met in this building at that time. And in 1980, they lost their pastor, and someone I knew who was an elder who'd been active with us in Crusade called and asked if I'd fill the pulpit. I was always glad to fill the pulpit because I could speak and say what I wanted to say and bug the people, and I didn't have to stay around and be the pastor and get complaints and things like that, okay? And I really liked the church because it had a flexibility. And so I ended up becoming the senior pastor in 1983, and we were in this building until 1993, and I preached there from 1980 to 1993. Now, when I came to the church, there were several things that I emphasized. One of them was I opposed legalism. Now, what is legalism? Legalism is when you absolutize something the Bible does not absolutize morally. When you have a moral teaching that's absolute, this is the way it is, no questions, and it's not in the Bible. And legalism functions in all kinds of subtle ways. For instance, the music up here is country-like music, okay? And that's the kind of music I love, and I love Sammy's music, and I really worship. There are other people who like a liturgical-like type of service, and that's what they like, and that's what ministers to them. Now, it's not wrong the way Sammy does it. It's not wrong to have a liturgical church. But where you get into trouble, let's say if somebody's in a liturgical church and they say, this is the way all churches need to worship. And what they're doing is they're absolutizing something the Scripture doesn't absolutize. And this works out in many ways. As a pastor, I would read books about being a pastor, having a church, etc. And these weren't the titles of the books, but they might as well have been. How to have a perfect church. And what it was is this pastor had been successful and he'd done A, B, C, and D. So you know what? Every pastor needed to do A, B, C, and D, and if they did, they'd have a perfect church. He was absolutizing for all churches his own experience. You get the same thing. Books that an equivalent are saying how to have a perfect marriage or how to raise perfect kids by people who've had success, and then they absolutize it for everybody else. And I really spoke strongly against legalism. And one of the reasons I did is that legalism had helped create the divorce that I had. Another thing I emphasized was God's grace and that he accepts us and that he gives us second chances. I told the story of my divorce after I'd been there a few months. And the church had a lot of single people in it, and it had many of them who'd been married before. And this may not be as true as much today, but back then, particularly if they were women, they felt ashamed. They felt somewhat like lepers. And I wanted to say, okay, if you've been divorced, this is a church you can come to. Now, I'm not saying divorce is a wonderful thing. Anybody who's gone through it knows it's a shattering experience. But God gives second chances. And we emphasize that, and we emphasize an atmosphere of grace. And I'll tell you one story of how that impacted somebody. In the early 2000s, Beverly and I decided to have our bathroom remodeled, and we heard of somebody in the church who had he just had a solo business, but he did remodeling, and he was good. And so we checked with him, and he came out and looked at it, and he did the remodeling and renovating of the bathroom. And because he just worked solo, it took a longer time than if he'd had several workers. And so while he was there, we got to know him, and we became friends. And Beverly spent a lot of time talking with him. And the friendship has remained. And he visited us last fall, and he has visited us several times in Fredericksburg. And here's his story. He grew up in Pennsylvania. His father, I think, was a welder and not a sensitive person, and he was artistic and sensitive. So when he's a teenager, he becomes gay. He moves to Dallas, he gets into the gay scene, has gay lovers, continues his business of remodeling. And one day he molests a 10-year-old at a swimming pool. So he's charged with a crime as a sexual offender, and he is sentenced to prison. Well, he was shattered by all of this. He wasn't really happy being gay. And so he tries to commit suicide through inhaling carbon monoxide from his car. It doesn't work. He ends up in the ER. And there's a Christian female doctor there. And he's, lying in his bed, recovering, and she comes in and talks to him about the Lord and witnesses to him and prays with him. And after she prayed with him, he really apparently accepted the Lord and committed his life to God. But he's going to go to prison, and he has a lot of issues, and so he goes into prison. And he gets involved in prison ministries that are going on. There's a lot of prison ministry that Christians carry on. He gets very involved in that, and one day he says, thinking of how he's gay, "Lord, why did you make me this way?" And the Lord just says back to him, "I did not make you this way." So he gets out of the gay lifestyle, and this is his story. He goes into prison gay. He comes out straight. So, after he comes out of prison, okay, I'm guilty of child molestation. I've been gay for most of my life. Now, where do I go to church? And he happened to know of this church, and we were at the time we were meeting, we had left this location and we're down in Meadow. But he started coming to the church and went to the singles group. He told them the whole story. They accepted him. They received him. He's there for several months, and there was a young woman who grew up as a child under communism in East Germany, but she was a Christian. She came to America as an au pair, and so she is looking for a church close by, and our church was close to where she was. So she comes to church on a Sunday morning. He meets her. They end up forming a romantic relationship. Now you just think of this. Suppose you had a daughter and she said, "Dad, I've just met this wonderful guy." "Well, tell me about him." "Well, he just got out of prison for child molestation and he's been gay for 15 years. Okay. And for whatever reason, her parents were willing to accept it. They got married. They have 2 neat little kids. And he's active in a church down in Deep Ellum, and they come and they visit us. Now, how did that happen? It happened because there was an atmosphere of grace where people who have blown it and had a lot of bad things in their life can come and be accepted and grow spiritually. So, as I look back over my life, I can say, okay, I know whom I have believed. Not what I believe, but whom I have believed. And am persuaded that he's able to keep what I've committed unto him against that day. And if you're facing issues and problems, finances, family issues, marital problems, illnesses, there is one that you can trust with absolute assurance, and that is our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, let's pray. Father, just thank you very much for Jesus and that he is absolutely dependable. And I thank you that we can depend upon him in every single way. And I pray this morning if someone needs to trust you here, needs to trust Jesus Christ, I pray they will do so. And Lord, I just pray you'll encourage us and strengthen us in our Christian life. In Jesus' name, amen.